I'm going to talk through some background and some examples to develop a definition of discourse analysis, and this will necessarily be broad for precisely these reasons, that it's a very broad field with a lot of variations in it, and some of those variations are particularly attached to different disciplines. So, as a starting definition, we can say that discourse analysis refers to a research approach which examines talk or some other language material like written documents, and sometimes other material altogether, like somebody's observations or images, whatever. It looks at this material as evidence that goes beyond the individual person. And that's perhaps a slightly tricky idea. Imagine you found some old letters, and they might be of interest because, say, it's somebody from your family or whatever. But they would also be interesting because they're social documents. They're evidence of how people lived at an earlier time, how they communicated. You might find interesting features of formality and informality, for example, what they took for granted. And discourse analysis is a research method for investigating social phenomena like these. This means that interview material, which is probably one of the most common forms of data which is analysed, interview material isn't treated as access to an individual like a therapy session. Instead, the analyst considers the interviewer and the interviewee as social beings who are interacting in a social environment and who are shaped and constrained by it. And the interview itself is usually analysed not just as one interview, but as part of a larger sample, so that comparisons can be made across different research participants and different occasions of talk. To show this in more detail, I want to look at some examples of transcribed talk from interviews, and that is talk which has been converted to written text. That process of transcription is itself complex. It's inevitably selective, which sometimes people don't realise. A choice is being made about what you want to write down from the speaking. You might just be interested in the words. You might be interested in some features of how they're said, obvious things like emphasis or questions. And you might also, if it's an interaction, be interested in points where people speak across each other or interrupt, or one person finishes off another person's utterance. The particular discourse analytic approach makes different features relevant. I'm going to start with a simple transcript, though not simple data, and this is an extract talk about where someone lives. Now, just before I look at the extract, of course you could examine where someone lives in other ways. I mean, even an address gives you a certain amount of social information about how a society is organised, how it's broken down, things like postcodes and so on. But as I say, I'm looking at interview material. And one of my interests here is in the values attached to places of residence. Now, not just in terms of market prices, although those can be connected, but what people value more generally. This is from a project for which I interviewed women about where they live. Right, so what do you value most then about where you live now? Living here now, safe. I mean, safety is important. Although we're living in London, here in particular, we're very close to the river. We've got lots of parks. It is built up, but there's quite a bit of space around. I think from that point of view of living in this place, we're very fortunate to have lots of royal parks, and we're very close to the river as well. It's close to central London, so that should we want to use museums and the theatres, etc., we can do that. Now, I said that this is not a study of an individual. So in the analysis, I looked for points which recurred across the talk of different participants. And I've underlined some of those here. There were a lot of references to safety. I won't have time to talk about those, unfortunately, but they were part of my final argument in the book where this is written up. There are some recognisable discourses of the city and of more natural surroundings, which are similar to those associated with the countryside. And here we've got one place which has city features being built up near central London, museums, and also rivers, space, the parks, so that there are associations of city and of a kind of natural world or almost a countryside all there together. Another feature which I've underlined is the emphasis on what people can do. Should we want to use museums and the theatres, etc., we can do that. Now that was a strong pattern in the data across the interviews. And it's not exactly talk about what the speaker does do. This woman is not saying, I go to museums every weekend. She's saying, we can if we want to. And this place appears to be doubly good because you can do the city things, and also you can enjoy a more natural world with the space and the parks and the river. Now, of course, not all the participants lived in London or close to a city centre or a river or a park, and so they couldn't mention those. But there was a common emphasis on what you can do, on possibility. It was a pattern in the data. It was evidence of a shared set of meanings, and those can be described by different analysts in different terms. So they might be talked about as a discourse, probably the most common term, an interpretive repertoire, a discursive resource which precedes any one person's talk and shapes it as a social product. Let's look at another example from a different speaker who lived in a very different place. So, what do you value most about where you're living now? Can you say that? It's a variety of things that are available in that environment. It's just everything is so easy to get to from there. And any kind of resources that I might need to have are very easily obtainable there, either from going to shops or getting places to bring stuff to us, or finding information as well. This place is a whole huge market area with kind of fashion and art and theatre, and there's so much there, you know, that's interesting, that you can just kind of have a look around. It kind of feels as if you're in touch with what's going on there, whereas other places I've lived have felt a bit kind of samey, high street stuff, and nothing kind of, I don't know, not the same kind of individuality. Okay, well, do you notice here that, again, there are references to possibility, and I've underlined those and some other features. So again, the place is described positively for what you can do from here, what's available, obtainable, where you can get to. And there's so much. This is the general attraction of a market, of course, all that choice. Also here, there's a rejection of a different kind of place, which is samey. Here, there's individuality. You can be in touch with what's going on. So this is a place for a certain kind of person, not someone conventional, someone who is either young or who places a value on youth. Now, from these and many other examples, across about 20 interviews, I developed an interpretation concerning the positive valuing of possibilities and choice, and of being the kind of person who appreciates choice, someone who has more options than she's likely to take up. And the value lies in having the options. You can see the obvious similarities to consumer identity here. The descriptions also make available identities which are linked to certain classes, and you perhaps picked that up in that first extract, and to certain age groups, here a bit. So, the places are described in a way which confirms valued identities for the people who live there. Now, I won't summarise the whole argument, but let me set out the assumptions which inform the analysis. In their talk, the participants describe these places, but they describe them selectively. The place could be talked about in different ways. The selective description constructs the place in a certain way, and here is full of possibility and options. Well, why? I'm assuming this performs functions for the speakers. One function is linked to identity, who I am. So the speaker is presenting herself. She speaks as a certain person. Here, this discerning, choosing person. She takes up this position, or positions herself. Now, I think it's important to note that this is unlikely to be the first time that this person has ever talked about where she lives or talked about it in this way. It'll be familiar, but she will also shape her answer to a question that's asked and so on. Talk is never the same on two different occasions. So what is said is probably a version of what has been said before. It's partly rehearsed. It's not a wholly novel, original invention. And we can set out those assumptions a little more formally. Excuse me. First of all, discourse analysis assumes that talk is social, and meaning by that, first, that it's shaped by shared resources. Different analysts might call these resources discourses or interpretive repertoires, and so on. But the point is that they're assumed to pre-exist one particular instance of talk and influence what can be said. And the talk is also shaped by its social contexts. And I've said contexts, plural, because there are a lot of them. There's the context of the interview and of the research project, which has set up certain expectations. And then you've got the context of the sort of wider social situation of that time, which might extend to what's on in the news, the state of the economy. You've got the context of the person's life, which you may or may not hear about. One person I interviewed for this project came in and she'd been mugged the day before, which had heavily, obviously, influenced her feelings about where she lived. So there are multiple contexts which can't be fully known, can't be fully taken account of, and can't be neatly separated. Now, a further assumption is that talk is a social practice. It's one of the practices of everyday life through which society is always being made and remade. Values are being reinforced, meanings are being established and modified. I want to look now at an example of a different approach to discourse analysis, which particularly emphasises this aspect of talk as practice. And this approach also uses a different form of data, although it is another example of talk about where people live. The data here are not interviews, but naturally occurring talk. And that just means talk that would have happened anyway, even if someone wasn't conducting a research project. The example I'll talk about is from some research by Professor Elizabeth Stokoe from Loughborough University. And she got recordings of talk from mediation sessions run by councils, which attempted to settle disputes between neighbours. Stokoe's particular interest is in categories. And she noticed that talk about problem neighbours often categorise people in a particular way, in terms of gender. And they often involve criticisms of women. Let's look at an example. And here's some people are complaining about the behaviour of a neighbour's child, who they call a lad. Two people here speaking together. You know, it's getting real serious, this is, but the lad keeps getting away with it, unfortunately. His mother hasn't got a bloke there, so she's talking in front of the children. She's not living there half the time, is she? No, she's out at night, and they're using it as a rendezvous for the gang. That's the whole top and bottom of it. It's like the dustbin left out for a week on the pavement. Now, this is someone else's research. I can't do full justice to it, not least because I haven't much time. But I want you to notice how a problem for these people about where they live is being presented in a whole mix of complaints. The boy isn't disciplined, he's getting away with it. His mother is single, she hasn't got a bloke there. She's a bad mother, she talks in front of these children, she isn't there half the time. And she's also apparently a bad housewife because she doesn't fulfill the duties of good housekeeping and get the dustbin in. And this one example was part of a pattern that this researcher found across a larger data set. In this case, the pattern of the categorization of women in highly moral terms as good and bad. Well, why should this be? One simple reason is that women are perhaps more likely than men to be associated with local domestic spaces, with neighbourhoods and homes. But Stokoe argues also that this talk functions as a form of regulation and policing about how women should behave. Now remember that idea of talk as a social practice which reinforces values, which reinforces how society is. This talk reinforces a gendered social order with particular, very conventional roles and expectations for women. So you've now seen two different approaches to discourse analysis. One that's focusing more on resources and on the constructions which they facilitate and the identities they make available. And this second one, which is more about practices and categorization. One looked mainly at the words that were used, and the other more at talk as interaction. And you might have noticed that transcription in that second example had some odd symbols which were about the interaction. They showed when different speakers overlapped or when one speaker picked up another person's comment and continued it as if they were constructing it together. Now, you've got other kinds of discourse analysis which have completely different foci, for example, on grammar. And you'll also find that there are different ways to approach similar topics. So, if you're interested in place, well, you might go up a level to national place. You might talk about England, Britain, the UK, about the differences there, about who is included and excluded in those categories. You might be interested in looking at policy documents or political talk. Alternatively, you might go back to very ordinary everyday talk. Susan Condor and Jackie Abel have done some fascinating research interviewing football supporters and looking at how they use national categories there as racist talk. So a lot of variety. Can we draw it all together into some single summary of discourse analysis? Well, we can try. Discourse analysis is the study of well-established meanings or ideas around a topic which shape how we can talk about it. Discourses of education, of health and illness, of place. We could add discourses of nation, discourses of mothering. All of these have been researched. But is this definition enough? Does it include practice and the ways that discourses change, how they're contested or reinforced? Is it too static, perhaps? Let's extend it. Discourse analysis is also the study of how meanings are established, used, challenged, and changed, including in talk. We could look at that change over historical time. You remember those letters that I mentioned. And one way of looking at social change, or studying it, is to look at changing meanings of how something is understood in different periods. For example, the meanings of home. Or we might just be studying society now, a part or an aspect of it. And if we accept that that summary, the one that I've given you already, that one there, we might then ask why social researchers analyse discourse. Well, quite a few possibilities. To understand our social worlds and their complexity, to understand the implications of certain meanings and worldviews, to understand ourselves within our social worlds. And usually, an assumption in this kind of research is that the researcher is part of what is being studied. It's an insider as well as an outsider view. There are different kinds of data which can be analysed, as I've mentioned. Now, it's not perfect. There are, of course, criticisms of it, as there are of any research approach. I've already mentioned disputes about whether it's okay to use interviews or whether you should only work with naturally occurring data. And there are other criticisms. Does this focus on larger systems of meaning, on discourses or discursive resources? Does that imply that society isn't about people? Are we assuming some transcendent system of meanings and we are just puppets to it? Well, not really. The assumption is in how the existing meanings are used and contested. But there is also an assumption that society pre-exists any individual. So any situation, it's a little bit like actors in a workshop who are improvising. If somebody else joins in, they can move the improvisation forward in new ways, but they're going to have to start with the scenario that's already there. They're going to have to interact with other people, and there'll be shared understandings which they'll need to lock into. We're part of a whole, in other words. And a rather different criticism is that discourse analysis is just about words. But think back to that example of the bad mother. I mean, think what it means to call someone a bad mother. It's clearly a strong personal insult, but it quickly involves other people, children, I mean, potentially school teachers, social services. And it's linked to social values, to ideas about how people should live, how they should bring up their children. It ties into a whole system of social values and practices and then institutions as well. And in discussing this, people often use the term that discourse is material. It goes beyond the words in a continuum into many other things. Okay, so to conclude, why do discourse analysis? Well, there are varied possibilities. I've mentioned two approaches, but there are many others. And it's a constantly changing approach. People will take it forward in new projects in different ways. It's interesting. And it's interesting, I think, because it's about people and their social worlds. Thank you very much.